Hi, you're listening to the YouTube edition of In Context. This is Ken McDermott Rowe.
And this is Gus Cantivero. Today we're going to be talking about public banking.
The idea is pretty simple. States will use their own funds as the reserve to create a new bank. And the bank that's owned by the state will make loans to promote infrastructure growth and business development within their own states. And it's very important business to get into for the states because during this terrible economic recession we're in, it's all about cut, cut, cut. And we need to think of creatively about new ways to grow our economy. And this seems to be a good way to do that.
How is this different than what the banks already do?
There's only one state in the country, the Bank of North Dakota, which has been involved in state banking since 1919, that has such an institution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's operated very successfully there as for almost a century. And in North Dakota, it's important to note that they have a very low unemployment rate and that they a budget which is one of the few state budgets which is in balance. So it's worked very effectively there for a century. And the tradition actually goes back to colonial times of state-owned banks, back to Pennsylvania. They had a state-owned bank, and it was championed by Benjamin Franklin, who attributed Pennsylvania's prosperity in the 18th century to the fact that Pennsylvania issued its own loans to create business development in that Commonwealth.
This is money that can be loaned to commercial banks that will then take that money and lend it at a reasonable interest rate to the citizens of the state to fund projects like infrastructure or...
It could be done for many different purposes, and it can be done in many different ways. The state bank could loan money directly for infrastructure projects, or in the case of North Dakota, often enters partnerships with other banks for large projects, or for emergency loans, or for, in some cases, student loans. It would all depend on the priorities of the state. Personally, I think that the main use of such a bank right now would be for infrastructure to promote the economic productivity of a given state, and also for small business loans for businesses that are cut off from private lending right now.
Right, and this is something that is a nonpartisan issue. This isn't something that we're advocating to benefit the bankers, because this money would produce future revenues that would then be paid back to the state.
Very good point, Gus. These bank loans made by the state bank will produce revenues from interest collected, even though the interest will be at a pretty reasonable rate compared to the private sector.
Right.
And that income from interest will go right into the state treasury.
So what is the relationship between the commercial banks that citizens can go up and interact with and get loans from to put their deposits into with a state-run bank?
Well, in the case of North Dakota, they didn't really go in big time into the savings accounts, the checking accounts. They see themselves as a catalyst for the private sector acting in partnership with other banks to make loans. State bank could have its own savings accounts and checking accounts, but it seems to me that's a need that's already been met by the commercial banks. Where we really have the need for state finance banks is for projects that are so long-term that the private sector wouldn't find a sufficient short-term return for them to get into it. Additionally, the state-owned bank would obviously not be paying huge bonuses to high-flying, risk-taking executives. The guys would be paid, who work there, would be paid reasonable salaries, and they wouldn't be charging exorbitant interest rates because the state could obviously set the interest rate at which it chose to lend money.
Beside North Dakota, which already has this bank functioning, aren't there other states around the country that currently have bills pending to create a state-run bank?
That's right. There are 7 states that now are considering bills to either create a state bank or to study the feasibility of creating a state bank, including Michigan, Massachusetts, Illinois, Virginia, and Oregon. So it's a substantial movement, and behind it now, or helping to foster it, is a new organization called the Public Banking Institute, which is chaired by Ellen Brown, who wrote a book called Web of Debt. And she's one of the leading money experts in America, and she's decided to put her knowledge of money to work to create a new state banking movement.
So to summarize, a commercial bank will lend money out at a high interest rate and earn a profit on that, which benefits them as a corporation. But a state-run bank would be taking the interest rate, which is much more moderate, and then putting that money back into the state coffers, which they can create more public service projects or reduce taxes or do whatever else that would benefit the citizens of that state.
Exactly, Gus, and it's really a no-brainer.
Not only that, but the states are investing their money into banks in other states or in other locales that is not benefiting the state in any way, any shape or form.
The biggest form of investments now are derivatives, and they're doing nothing for your local state development.
Well, one of the problems that's hitting the economy right now is that we've seen a lot of the states and cities invest their money into funds that have been completely pilfered by the economic crisis right now, causing all the layoffs and budget cuts.
And as a state agency, this state bank will be subject to the scrutiny of the elected representatives. So there's going to be accountability.
Do you think that the opponents of the public banking might say that this is going to put the government in a position where they can choose the winners and losers in the economy?
I think there has to be a concern that you want the bank to be run on a very business-like basis, and I think that this banking community can be brought to understand that this will benefit them too. If a state economy is increased in prosperity because of investment in infrastructure, that's going to be a boost to businesses of all kinds. Thanks very much for listening to this YouTube edition of In Context. This is Ken McDermott Rowe.
And Gus Cantaveras.